Welcome to the What's Your Grief podcast. I'm Eleanor Haley.
And I'm Lisa Williams. We're the mental health professionals turned grief friends turned co-founders of the website What's Your Grief.
In this podcast, we talk candidly about all things grief, from pop culture to grief theory.
No tilted heads, no soothing tones, just us and our grief friends exploring the always devastating,
often confusing,
and sometimes even funny experience of living life after loss.
Hey, welcome to another episode of the What's Your Grief podcast. This is Eleanor, and as always, I'm joined by Lisa. Hi, Lisa.
Hi. How are you?
Oh, wow. Flipping the script. I'm doing pretty well. Feeling like I might be getting a little under the weather, but that's okay. I'm going to push on through that feeling. But I am a little discouraged if that is the case, because I have a lot I want to do in the next couple days. I'm visiting some family at the end of the week. So I was trying to front load a lot of my work at the beginning of the week. And now I'm concerned that I'm not going to be able to accomplish much, which feels like par for the course these days. Actually, I do want to say something to all the listeners out there. And it is this. If you feel like there are things that you want to change or need to change, and you're having a really hard time doing it, I feel you. People are always saying things like, just do this, just do that. You listen to self-help, or you read a book about habits, and it's like, oh, it's just that easy. These little things you can do. Even you and I say things like, sometimes, when you're feeling bad, it's a matter of just doing things. And I just want to acknowledge that just doing something sometimes can be really hard, even if it's the smallest thing. It might not be that the thing you want to do is hard. It might not be physically demanding. It might not be logistically demanding, but the disconnect between getting from knowing you need to do something and doing it can sometimes be a lot harder than you think it ought to be. And then you feel like a dummy, because it's why can't I just do it? Because it's hard.
It is. And I think that one of the things that can be discouraging, or that can even affect, I guess, that underlying momentum to do it, is when in the past you've seen yourself try and then backslide. And I mean, I'm projecting my own stuff on this, because as I texted you yesterday, this week in my own time management, I really ambitiously decided to take a new approach to how I was going to manage my time during the week. And again, self-help. Here we come. I listened to an episode of the good old Huberman Lab, and Cal Newport was on, who I really like. He wrote the book Deep Work, which has been really influential in how I think about my own work. And he talked about how he doesn't make to-do lists, how he just blocks things into his calendar, and he doesn't use a to-do list. And so I decided to go about my week differently this week and make a calendar and not a to-do list and whatever. And I texted you because I did get the momentum to do the thing. But then I immediately was oh, I feel like I'm setting myself up to be disappointed or discouraged when it doesn't go well. I've put all this effort into the front end of trying this new thing. And what happens if I'm not magically as productive as Cal Newport, and it doesn't revolutionize things, or I'm not able to sustain it. So it's interesting, because I feel like there's these layers. There's actually doing the things, and then there's sometimes you do the things that you think you should do, and sometimes they are really amazing and helpful, but sometimes they're not, or sometimes you're not successful. And then all of that baggage goes into the next time that you're approaching trying to do something new.
I'm right there with you on that, because I feel at my age, I've tried so many different things, ways to get organized, bullet journaling, blocking out time, things like that. And nothing really seems to change me. deep down. And I mean, I do think a case could be made that it's negative self-talk, because I'll do that sometimes too. When I start to get into an exercise routine, I'll get 2 weeks in and I'll be like, oh, I've been here before. And then I get sick and something throws me off and I'm done. And so I do engage in that negative self-talk, but also at some point I'm like, maybe I just need to be reasonable with myself about the types of things that do work and don't work for me. And maybe what I actually need is not another meal plan, but like to actually have a lifestyle change that's not a 6-week program or something like that, but something that really changes foundationally why and how I do things. And I've not been able to make the shifts I want to make. And those little programs, little things, none of those stick for me. And I don't know, I am so curious about the people who have taken on something like that and it's really stuck for them. What is it? What's the key?
Well, and I think that 6-week programs and all those things, they're so appealing because they give you this idea that somehow they're going to flip a switch for you. They, I feel are the equivalent of just do this. It's going to make everything
or it'll get
easier.
You enough momentum to keep going. And I haven't found that to be the case for me.
It's interesting because I feel maybe as a product of my ADHD, I have sort of long ago learned that oftentimes I feel things like that don't work very well for me. I've tried in recent years to lean into more of the idea of just understanding what my strengths are and trying to lean into those and listen for things that feel part of the reason this Cal Newport thing, I decided to give it a try was because I was oh, this actually feels more aligned with me or the way I think about time than to-do lists do, which to-do lists I feel are not very well aligned with the way my brain works. So I was I'm going to try this because it feels it maybe is more naturally what I'm good at anyway, which is using momentum when I have it and leaning into sometimes really long blocks of time and diving into deep work and, kind of doing that. And that's the only thing that I think has helped me to get better has been let me stop trying to force myself into using someone else's guide when their brain is nothing like my brain, and instead trying to be wait, what does my brain do well? When do I actually feel things are going well? And how can I look for things that amplify that and lean into it? I mean, obviously still clearly since I'm starting a new thing this week, we know it hasn't nothing has magically stuck, but I do think certain things have. I just saw that somebody from our Griever Hub put in the chat that they've tried the Pomodoro technique. And I've also in deep work, it's a little different, but similar ideas about timing, how to actually set a timer and work for a set period and then take a little bit of time for a break and then coming back. And I've also found that to be really helpful too, because we all know distraction is a serious issue for me. And so timers really help me.
I think distraction is a serious issue for a lot of people these days because there's just, I'm finding that's a big issue for me. I do. I like the strengths idea. That's one thing that has been helpful. I think just a very simple thing. I think in the past, maybe Gretchen Rubin, I heard her say on her happiness, I think that's the name of her podcast, just mentioning something about recognizing what your strengths are and working with those. And the example is if you're not a morning person and you're tired in the morning, don't plan to go on a run, at 6 a.m. if you're not a morning person. And that's why I was because I do feel I've constantly been trying to fit myself, a square peg into a round hole sometimes with some of those things because they work for someone else or someone said it's a good way to do it. And I do think that as I've grown older, I'm kind of learning to be real with myself. But sometimes I feel I'm just slipping, I'm constantly just slipping back into who I am over and over again. And maybe that's just what is reality for people. You do just tend to slip into your tendencies a lot. And sometimes progress is really small and really slow. And maybe I'm just not being very realistic with myself, but it is hard, especially for our audience who's grieving, it's really hard. Some of these very little things that maybe before felt really easy for you, maybe before it felt really easy for you to get in 30 minutes of exercise or get in a new routine and things like that. And Now it doesn't feel like that because you're going through something and your capacity is just different. And I think that that can be very disorienting. And that's something I've experienced in many contexts in which I feel like I'm experiencing now at this point in my life for other reasons. But, you know.
Yeah, I had a great conversation with a grief therapist who's in our grief professionals community who also has ADHD. And we, one of the things we were talking about ADHD and grief, which is like a whole separate topic, but we were talking about how grief for many people causes things to be a lot harder for them in ways that are not dissimilar to ADHD, like problems with focus, with concentration, with memory, with distractibility, like with all of those things. And one thing that she said that I thought was so interesting and insightful was she said, in a lot of ways, I think my ADHD was helpful because I already had all these adaptive techniques and tools that I'd had to develop over the course of my life before my grief. So yes, those things got a little bit worse, but I like already had this toolbox that existed. And how so many people who are grieving, if things have come easily or naturally, like time management or organization or motivation or being able to implement, routines like meditation or exercise, if that's come easily and you've never needed adaptive tools, it's so hard to suddenly be grieving and then trying to figure out what are the adaptive tools that are going to help me with the fact that now I'm like misplacing everything and I keep locking my keys in the car or, forgetting things or not being able to concentrate, that it sort of becomes this really difficult double whammy. And I had never really thought about it before in that way. But I think at least in the realm of some of those things like organization and time management and memory and things like that, that it is true. Like if you've never had to work at it or if the things that always worked before suddenly aren't working, it's really hard to be figuring out what new things might help when you're also in the depths of grief.
Yeah, I think that it just like kind of goes to show you, like grief challenges us all in different ways. For some people it's a challenge because they aren't comfortable with the emotions that they're experiencing, and for some people it's things like you just described. And so the challenges are different, and the strengths and tools we have to address them are different. And one of the things we've been talking a lot about, and maybe we'll talk more about in the future, we've been working with some folks who are in the positive psychology program at the University of Pennsylvania. Is that right? Yes, I'm sorry. My memory is terrible today. But just talking about how really recognizing our strengths and like leaning into our strengths can be such a help in our grief. It can't solve all our problems. It can't address every stressor or distressing thing that we experience, but sometimes it can make some things easier, and really being kind of reliant on those strengths can at least help us in some ways. So I feel like strengths has come up a couple times in this conversation. So I really like that idea of like really leaning into those things.
Yeah, because I think it is. It like when we lean into strength, it also speaks to that idea that there's no checklist. There's no like 6-week plan that's going to work for everybody. There's no kind of easy fix. It's often doing that self-reflection work to create an individualized plan that's going to work for each of us. And it's different, which is, I think it's frustrating, right? It's like the reason that I'm always so tempted, and Instagram knows it and feeds it to me in the algorithm to like buy another planner. Like I somehow think that like this is going to be the magic planner that is going to help me kind of get myself together. And I think other people do it with other things, right? Like with journals or with 6-week programs or, with things like that. And it's often looking for something outside that someone else has created that's going to be the fix that we can just plug into. And I think sometimes looking at it from the opposite way of going, maybe I need to put in the time to think about what are my own strengths and how do I develop coping and self-care that really matches my own needs.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that I'm really feeling right now is that what I actually know I need is sustainable change. And that's the thing that's hard to get to. Like, I love planners. I love, like, even even talking about those 6-week program, things like that. Like a lot of times those things I know full well are procrastination for me. They're the simple things that I can do to procrastinate getting to a place of real sustainable change. And that's something that I can recognize. And yet I still want to go there all the time, because there are things about it that I think are going to help. But in many ways, I recognize that this phase of change has become a bit of procrastination for me. And what I need is something that's really going to be sustainable. And that's the thing I'm not really sure how to achieve, because I know all those other things are not really going to be the thing. So yeah, I think that this is something that we struggle with at all times, probably. Like some people feel like they've gotten to a place where they're like, I feel pretty balanced. I feel pretty good. I feel pretty set. But I think a lot of us are not there. And, maybe we have spent time there, but like something has happened and we've been thrown off. And so, when you're grieving, it's the case. And when you're living, it's the case. And it's different challenges. It's different kind of resources and energies that you have to go into these things.
Yeah, I listened to this really interesting thing the other day as we're talking about this and like our own experiences with trying different things and backsliding and how it cycles and all of this. I listened to this really interesting thing that was about influencers and influencer kind of like recipe or the playbook of influencer marketing, and how it was talking about across all different things that an influencer might be trying to sell you on or convince you about. That it's sort of oftentimes like, oh, 6 months ago, I was in this struggling place that like you, my audience, probably relates to. And like now, here's where I am. And like in this really aspirational way, whatever that is, paints a picture of what that looks like. And then it's like, so, join my program, buy my course, start using essential oils, start using this makeup, like whatever it is, it's kind of that. And that it was just talking about sort of why that's so appealing to us for what we're talking about right now. Like, that. And I was thinking about how like that's true in grief too, like with so many grief influencers who are out there. It's like, oh, I was, kind of at this place and now this. And it's so, I think, hard for me because I look at that and I'm like, there's never been anything that I would ever be like, and here is what permanently solved my problem in this area. And it never went back or regressed or backslid or cycled or whatever, because that's just not how life is. Yeah. Like even the perfect makeup that you started using that like was perfect for your foundation when you were 30, like it's not perfect anymore when you're 40. Like that's just how it works. Like there's no perfect answers to these things. We always need to be self-aware and updating and editing and reflecting and shifting and changing. And I think in the influencer world, in the marketing world, being aware that like oftentimes things are trying to tap into our desire for the easy answer or the procrastination thing that we're going to try, the quick fix, and be aware that we might be really easily swayed by that and buy something because of it. But oftentimes it's not really the path to what's going to help us long term.
Yeah, it's funny because it's so easy to spot for me personally when it comes to grief, because I'm like, no, the journey is different for everybody. The things that work, their strengths, their areas of needing support and help are different. It's so easy for me to spot that when it comes to grief. But when it comes to other things, like I'm pretty discerning. Like I feel like I'm not really a sucker for a lot of stuff. But when it comes to things like, oh, this helped me get organized, or this helped me like get on track, even though I know that like we were talking about, my strengths and my weaknesses and my needs are very different than that person's or anyone else's, I do tend to be like, oh, maybe this is the thing,
Yeah. And like your life circumstances change. Like, I mean, just thinking about you I'm like, let me thinking of you for as an example. Like you had kids. Well, you had kids who'd gotten a lot older, and like your life had sort of settled out into a certain routine, and then like all of a sudden you had another unexpected baby and life changes that went with that. And it's like even if we find things that work in one version of our life. And it's not unrelated to what we wanted to talk about today. I mean, I think the thing that we wanted to talk about was a topic that somebody in our Griever Hub mentioned. I mean, we labeled it grief flare-ups, though I don't even know that that's the right way to think about it. I think it's maybe just a little bit more the cycle, the way that grief cycles, and the way that like there are times, not just in the beginning, not just in like that, oh, grief triggers or what activates your grief, or, you know, kind of that early on grief comes in waves idea, but just that even over the long term, the way that we continue to notice that there are times where grief comes up in really specific ways and it feels very overwhelming or close to the surface, or it's manifesting in one way in a particular time, you know, many years later, even when maybe you're thinking, wow, like for the last year or two, it's been in a very different place. It's felt very different. And what is it? Like, what is it about grief when we make this point to say it's not linear? This is what we're pointing to, I think, but I don't know, maybe like more deeply thinking about why that is and what that means.
Yeah, I think the best analogies I can ever think of when it comes to grief, for me personally, how I've experienced grief is as like this kind of living, breathing entity, even though on the other hand, I want to always be like, grief is human. It's a part of us. You know, it's an expression of all these things that we're thinking and feeling. In many ways, grief does feel like this character in our lives. Like when we talk to kids, we often talk about the grief monster and how we run away from the grief monster. At first, it seems very scary, but when we kind of turn towards it and invite it in, we see it's more like one of those friendly monsters in a Pixar movie kind of thing. Friendly might be the wrong word, but not harmful. It doesn't want to hurt us. And thinking about grief in this context, I almost think of grief as like being this reoccurring character in our lives. It's a very present character for the maybe months, years even after someone we love dies, but then it becomes this kind of character that comes back. You know, it shows up, maybe it's gone for a couple of months or even a year, and then all of a sudden it turns back up and it's there sitting on our couch once again. And the question is, why is that the case? Why do we sometimes have new experiences of grief years later? And why, when we're going through life, it may feel like not necessarily we're having like a secondary loss or a new experience of grief, but why at other times does it feel like we're more connected with our grief than ever? Like it's kind of more present, you know, looming large.
It does, to me, it strikes me a little bit as something that people might resonate with more if they are a little bit further out. Because I think in the beginning, you're like, oh, the grief whatever character, friend, monster is like sitting on my couch all the time. Like I can't even imagine that wouldn't be the case. But I do think as you get further out and that starts to change, it can be hard to you want to find a rhyme or reason. You want to like look for what's the pattern. Why does it feel like something has really brought this up now as compared to where it was just a few months ago? And as we talk about this, I want to be mindful to say, sometimes there's not a straight line answer. Like sometimes we want to know, like, what was the trigger? What activated this? Why is this happening in this way? And I think one thing to be mindful of is just that, like, sometimes there isn't like one straight line. There's a lot of different things. And so if you are prone to wanting to like investigate that in your mind and rehash it and like ruminate around it, sometimes it's not worth spending too much time on this, like trying to figure it out. But it can be helpful to just spend a little time with it and think about why it may ebb and flow in different ways.
And I think that's kind of like what in not in so many great words I was trying to say is that sometimes it's obvious why the grief is coming up. Like maybe I'm close to the age when my mother died. And so I'm really kind of in that place where I'm like thinking about that, thinking about how old she was, thinking about how I feel in this moment, thinking about how devastating it would be for me at this point to be in her shoes or for my family. So there are times when it's like really obvious. Maybe it's another secondary loss. Maybe you lose someone else who was very close to that person or the home that they lived in. Like there are these secondary losses that come up. Maybe it's something positive. Someone gets married, a graduation, what that they're missing. So sometimes it's really obvious. But then there are times where we're just feeling especially griefy. And these are the times like what I think of when you were just talking, when you just feel especially griefy, like you may feel like those similar feelings. You may feel kind of pulled back towards the past, like your memories and your thoughts, and you're not quite sure what's making it feel this way. I think the original topic or question kind of was like, why some years does the anniversary feel particularly difficult when other years it felt very manageable? Like, and I've heard people say this about other things like birthdays or holiday seasons. Why was my last holiday season feeling pretty good, but now this year I'm feeling terrible again about grief? And so it can be very confusing. Why are we sometimes just in that especially griefy place? And like you said, like, I don't know that there's a clear-cut answer usually.
Yeah, or that the answer it's diffuse. Like it's a lot of things. And I think using the example of the holidays is for me a helpful one, because that's a time of year where regardless of grief, right? Some holiday seasons are wonderful and some are not so wonderful. And oftentimes the difference is just because of a whole host of factors that are reflective of where we are in our life at the moment, what stressors have been there, what the year has been like, where we are in terms of our other relationships or finances, or how connected we're feeling to meaning and purpose, or all these things. Like aside from grief, that can really impact how we feel at various times of year. And so oftentimes when we bring grief into it, it's always interwoven into all of those other threads, like as part of the fabric of what our life has become. And so then when we're talking about something like the anniversary, or we're talking about their birthday or our own birthday or whatever it is, we have grief as one of the threads, but we still have all of those other threads that are impacting the way that that time of year is coming together for us, or that moment is coming together for us. So it really, I don't know, it sort of reflects all of it. And with time, I think grief becomes the singular defining thing in the beginning, you know, that sort of defines, it feels like it defines every time of year. And then I think as time goes on, it starts to be more, you know, one of those many threads.
Well, and like it's present in your unconscious or your conscience. It's there. You have that memory, you have that experience. And sometimes our brains just do things, you know, without us being aware of why. Sometimes we retrieve memories and things just because something going on reminds us of that time. Like an example of this would be like maybe you go back to your old elementary school and all of a sudden you're flooded with memories you would have never retrieved before because you have these context clues. And in some ways, it can be that emotion works in a similar way, where when you're in a certain emotional state, you have kind of this like effect where you think back to other times when you felt similar types of emotions. And so you may just be kind of more in touch with that griefy side of life and with those memories because that's the mood state you're in at that time. So sometimes we're just retrieving things. It's not necessarily that our grief is flaring up.
I was just going to say, related to this, you know, something that you mentioned when we were talking about this topic was something I have thought about quite a bit recently. And that's the idea that when things are difficult in life, or when we're facing transition or challenges or things like that, that research has found that something that we do when we've lost somebody who's really important to us is we will use them as like what they call a safe haven, right? Like a place that we go back to, that we think about how they might have comforted us or what advice they might have given us. Or, we kind of retreat a little bit to our memory of them in a way that helps us to get through this really difficult time. And, for me, I've been thinking about that a lot lately because there's been some health issues that have been coming up with my mom. And it's been really interesting. It's been so long since my dad died, but it's been really interesting that I've found myself thinking a lot more about my dad because of that, in a way that I think is very much this sort of safe haven idea. And so I think that there's a lot of times in life where we're going through transitions, where we're going through other moments where maybe we're tapping into our memory or our memories of different people who died, who were important to us. And so it brings our grief to the surface in that way, in a new way, where suddenly we realize, wow, I feel like I'm feeling more connected to them because of these different circumstances.
I love the concept of the safe haven. It's kind of like in attachment theory when they talk about it, just when we talk about attachments with kids and adults, it's like that idea of having a parent in the next room when you fall down and bang your knee, you have that safe haven to run back to. And then as we're older, it might be the best friend we can call on the phone. And I think that it makes sense that if someone who was a support to us, who took care of us, who loved us, dies, that we would continue to revisit and think about them. But like you said, it can feel comforting to think about. But then I also think, like we always say with continuing bonds, there's two sides to the coin, because on the one hand, it's comforting to think about what they would say or what they would do or what they would want. But then there's that reminder that, gosh, this would be easier if they were here. I really wish they were here to help with this situation. I really wish they were here to guide me, because I'm not really sure how to handle this and I'm afraid right now. And so there is that double side to it, because on the one hand, it can be comforting. And on the other hand, there's that emptiness because you actually wish that they were here to help you share this burden, or to at least give you some comfort in the present day, in the moment. And so I think that it is that it's that two-sided thing. I also think that tough times, when we're going through tough times, just cause us to think back to other tough times, right? Like, what did we go through? How did we handle it? What coping worked for us, and things like that. And sometimes it's in a way that we're like, okay, like I just said, what worked for us, what helped. But sometimes it can be like, oh no, I don't want to go back here again, kind of like, am I sliding? Right. So I do also think that sometimes it's normal to kind of think back to other times that felt similar. And that can be comforting if we draw from it, like the things we learned, but it can also be scary.
And I think sometimes it's both, and so that makes it even harder to tease out a little bit of what, is this, we want to think is this helpful or not helpful? Is this good or bad? Is this comforting or not comforting? And often it's like, oh, it's all of it. And it's like grief. It's closer to the surface in ways that sometimes are both really making things both more painful and more comforting at the same time. And again, I think no matter how often we say it and talk about dialectical thinking and know that rationally, it's still a strange experience to feel. When you're feeling it emotionally, it can feel really confusing or really, I don't know, just difficult to label or difficult to explain and make sense of. So I think that is one of the things that can be really tough with it.
I think that, like you said at the beginning, if you're really early on in your grief, I think it's probably hard to relate to this idea, because everything is the grief is very present.
President?
No. The grief is very present at all times. And so I think it's hard to imagine getting to this place where it's kind of just this diffuse feeling. But I think someday, maybe if you get to that place, you'll recognize it. And I think it'll be important to know that it's normal and it happens. I really think the more loss I personally experience, the more I go through, the older I get, I just realize that life is just a dance, or, a roller coaster, or whatever analogy you want, where it's never one thing. You don't just get to a place. You are constantly moving emotionally and mentally and cognitively and physically sometimes, where it's up and it's down. And it's just really making me realize how much we need to kind of hold on to those feelings, those times that feel really good, and try to be present for them, but also just know that like we're also going to be feeling, you know, the sadness and the difficult times again. It's not like we're going to pass them by and they're going to be gone. They're just going to come up, and this is life.
Yeah, and to be open to them, you know, I think this weekend I had like a really emotional day on Saturday. I like feel myself getting emotional even thinking about talking about it, because I have two friends who die. I know we just talked about friendship loss, but two friends who died not too long ago, not a couple of years ago now, but who are a couple, and who they didn't have kids, and they lived on their boat. And my ex-husband and we didn't buy a boat because of them, but they're like I think, you know, my ex, he grew up on boats, and that was like a big thing. But these were friends who we always used to go and like stay with on their boat, and just I don't know, like I appreciated that so much. And my ex-husband, he messaged me and told me he was thinking about, he kept the boat. He's a boat person. And he was thinking about selling the boat. And I think he just kind of, I don't know, wanted to like run it by me or whatever. And I could not believe how unbelievably like overwhelmed with grief I was. I mean, both, there was the part about our relationship, right? Like it certainly represented things about our relationship that were sad, but that it really, for me, just like surfaced this stuff about my friends who died, and like feel like it like completely knocked me over. And I would never, I don't think I ever would have guessed. I think if you had described this situation to me theoretically, I would have said there will be a lot of emotion about that tied to my marriage, you know, tied to the fact that like it represented this, you know, this thing that we bought together at a totally different moment in my life. But what it instead like it brought up this thing I didn't see coming at all. And I really was like, on Saturday when this happened, I was just like, all right, I'm just going to accept that like this is going to be a grief day. And I was like, I'm just going to like lean way in, because I was like, I did not see this coming. I kind of had no idea. But I think sometimes, I mean, this is again one of those more discrete experiences where it was very clear why. It wasn't one of those moments where I was like, why does my grief feel near the surface? But where I guess the piece that I think may be helpful in it is that I was just like, I am just going to like lean into this and sort of give myself the space for it, and like recognize and appreciate that like this is something that obviously I need to give myself some space to grieve. But that, like, again, sometimes it just comes up. And I think sometimes you have to be like, oh, all right, there's that guy, that grief guy sitting on the couch.
Yeah,
and
that
we're just going to settle in.
Series regular.
Series regular here.
It's interesting though, because, you know, when I was right before you said that, I was saying, there are ups and there are downs, and be present for the ups. And I don't think I was saying that for the downs. I was kind of saying like, get through the downs. And what you just described is being present for the downs too. And I do think that that's an interesting like shift, because I do think sometimes we want to just withstand them or minimize them or put them away. And maybe being present for them, it might not teach you like why it's here, why is it shown up, but it'll probably give you something, teach you something. There's grist for the mill, as they say. And so I do like that idea. Now, had you been off to like give a presentation somewhere or something, you probably could not have done that. So sometimes we don't have the luxury.
It was conveniently a Saturday.
Right. But if you do, I guess, the thing I'm taking from that is to be just as present for all of it.
I do think like by creating space for it, and by just being like, oh wow, this is a thing. This has clearly like opened up a big grief chasm for me. And it had me thinking about why I don't know necessarily if it was in a way that was maybe a little bit constructive. If nothing else, I think it gave me some insight into something else we talked about recently, which was continued bonds, which is, I think that like for me, our boat, which, I mean, first of all, I feel this like need to clarify. This is like a piece of crap boat from
Yeah, it's not a yacht.
1978. Like, if anybody has a yacht in their mind, like, put that aside. This was like this fixer-upper boat that was like, oh my God, that is still a fixer-upper boat that we bought. And they also lived on this like small, unbelievable. They when they found out they couldn't have kids, they sold their house and they decided to move onto a boat full time because they were kind of changing the trajectory of their life. But I realized that I think our boat, though we had it when they were still alive, like it felt like a continuing bond. Like I certainly could see the way that like having that boat was because of them and the way that they like inspired us to think that that was actually a possibility for us, like that we could buy an old beat up boat and fix it up and do stuff with it. And so it felt like that thing that we talk about of like when physical connections are disappearing. It felt like that disappearing, but it did give me this space where I think I spent a lot of time like reflecting on all of the psychological bonds, you know, all the other non-physical things, and was able to kind of make a little bit of peace with the idea that like it's not about this physical boat. Like I don't, you know, it's not about that. It's about so many other things in like, yeah, their sense of adventure and their like ability to kind of inspire, I think, a kind of envisioning their life after loss. Like infertility is a huge loss, and to realize they were going to be childless and like figure out what they were going to do was because they really wanted kids, and to make that shift, like those were huge things. And so I spent a lot of time thinking about that in a way that did feel maybe constructive, I guess.
Yeah. And I think what you're describing is interesting because I do think that feeling of finite like goneness and that feeling like, okay, so this really is over, can sometimes be tied to those physical ties and in ways that we don't even necessarily know it. And so what you're describing kind of illustrates that this can hit us way after the death actually happens. And I think how you handled it makes total sense. And it's exactly what I think I would tell to someone else. But it's a moment of grief and also trying to just remember, how am I still connected without those physical bonds? And yeah, it's tough. There's, you know, it's not, there's no solution to it, right? Like the thinking about the psychological connections doesn't solve the hurt or anything, but it is something to still hold on to. So yeah, we've like been all over the map today, but hopefully other things.
It's been a long and winding road. All right.
It sure has. Well, so I guess if you have anything to add to this conversation or the many other things that we've touched on, you can always reach out to us at What's Your Grief on Facebook and Instagram. And you can email us at what'syourgrief@gmail.com. And other than that, I guess until next time.